Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And Chris, it's finally over. The 2024 presidential election is over. The ads on TV have stopped. The text messages have stopped. The calls have stopped. It's over.
And we say thank you because we can say that it is truly over and there's no long lasting every day. We're seeing what the polls are going to say. I mean, besides maybe a few House races, this election is once again, we've talked about this through many different episodes about the craziness of the 2024 election, and it proved to be up to the very end crazy. And so I, for one, would like to thank all the candidates for not calling me anymore and for using my mailbox. I am thankful that I have a little while that I can go and not worry about who's doing what, where they're doing it.
Well, I was talking to some of my students. I think this was Tuesday. It was Tuesday. Which was election day, of course. I had a student in my class who had gotten a text message from Joe Biden. And I said, "You're awfully important to be getting a text message from Joe Biden." Of course, it was one of those robo things, but it was funny because I asked them, I said, and a lot of these students in this particular class, Chris, are dual enrollment. So they're enrolled in high school and college at the same time. And I asked them, I said, "How many of you are under 18?" And of course, before I could finish my sentence, like half the class raised their hand. And I'm like, well, that was rude. But, but, and I said, well, wait a minute. How many of you are under 18 and you've been getting phone calls and text messages and stuff from candidates and stuff? And every single one of their hands went up. So it didn't matter if you were young or old, it didn't make any difference. You were being bombarded with these robocalls and robotexts.
You were, and I do think that this election shared with us a lot of things, and kind of that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this today is because we it's kind of an election in review, where we just go back and we discussed a lot of the twists and turns and the October surprises, but really it was a November surprise. And I
Mhm.
think we'll start off with by talking about how the election polls were really unique because our listeners, you and I are history nerds, we're election nerds. We've been eating all of this up. We were annoyed by text messages and ads and all, but the behind the scenes inner workings of how things are playing out consumed us and captivated us. And one of the things I think that really had us is we saw this year of how much media influence was trying to happen. That you really saw this year that I don't even know if I could say it's media. We saw ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, PBS, NPR, all of these different. C-SPAN was probably the only one that honestly tried to just paint an even picture. But
Mhm.
every single news organization made it very clear that they had a candidate,
Yep.
made it very clear that they were trying to push an agenda, if you will, to push a particular candidate. And what we see is that the American people are really smart and intelligent, and that they don't necessarily go to news sources to make a decision, but that they use their own intellect and basically their own current situation, I think, to make the decision as to who's the best person to be my president for the next 4 years.
Yeah, I heard the Michael Spurkanis show from CNN. He has his own XM radio show on POTUS, and I was listening to that this morning. I was taking the dog to the vet this morning, and I was listening to that, and he was talking about, and I thought he made a very good point about this, is that what he was saying was that Americans didn't like being told who they should not vote for. Basically, he was saying that one of the reasons Trump may have done better than expected was that people were tired of being told you can't vote for him, you shouldn't vote for him, and that it was a pushback against that, at least in part. And I think there were probably other issues that were weighing heavier on people's minds, but I think it is interesting. Was there sort of a backlash against the media in this election where people were like, well, don't tell me who to vote for. I'll vote for who I want. Going back to what you said, people are making up their own minds and they're not necessarily being influenced by celebrity. They're not necessarily, because there was all this concern about on the Trump team about Taylor Swift and her influence on the election, but it didn't make much difference. So, the endorsements, celebrity endorsements didn't make a difference. The political endorsements didn't make a difference. People seem to be, as you said, just there to make up their own mind, and they were consuming news not so much to make up their mind, but because they had already made up their mind. And that's the interesting thing.
And I go back to I really think that at the end of the day, and I remember it was James Carville, who is still out there, but he's not the political pundit or the political strategist that he once was. He was extremely relevant and popular during Bill Clinton's day. He kind of helped
Hmm.
Bill Clinton become president in the 90s. And he said a statement, I think in 1992, in which he said, "It's the economy, stupid." That was his quote.
Hmm.
And Ray, and I really think that that was the one thing that probably separated both parties more than any other issue was the economy. And the Democrats tried to say, we're going to help you as we move forward. We're going to try to do these things. And the Republicans were saying, but look at what's happened the last 3.5 years. Has anything changed? What will be different? And both parties were basically looking at the idea of money and how much it costs. I remember somebody being blown away, one of the news columnists being blown away saying, "Oh, I didn't know that butter was $7." And that concept that people that they were hearing from did not know how difficult it was for the average everyday person to put food on their table, to put gas in their car, just to be able to make it. And I do think that James Carville's comment, "It's the economy, stupid," probably had more to do with this year's presidential election than anything else, because whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, the reality is things are expensive nowadays.
Yes, they are expensive, and I don't remember who said it, but it goes along with James Carville's quote that you were talking about. It is, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" And take the pandemic out of the picture, which I know is very hard to do. Things are more expensive today than they were 4 years ago. Now, I'm not going to sit here and blame any presidential administration for that necessarily, but when you're in a campaign, you sort of have to acknowledge that, and you have to, you know, to run on, how are we going to make these changes? And when you're the administration in power, when you're the vice president of an administration in power, that's hard to do because it's like, well, what have you done over the past 4 years? You're talking about lowering prices. Well, have you done that over the past 4 years? And so and I was talking to someone the other day, and it's also something I've been thinking about for a little bit, and that is it's very hard for a vice president to become president on their own. Put aside the vice presidents that became president because the president died or resigned. Put that aside. Looking in our lifetimes, let's just look at, you know, Jimmy Carter Ford. You have George Bush, he was elected president, and then you have Joe Biden. That's it. And Joe Biden wasn't on the heels of the Obama administration. That was 4 years later. So it's hard for a vice president to become president on their own because they carry the weight of the administration they represent. And when the administration they represent is governing in a time when the economy's not doing well, whether it's their fault or not, that's something they have to carry into the election.
Yeah, and I remember reading a very interesting statistic that said that in 2023, half of American renters spent more than 30% of their income just on rent and rent alone. And that put them in a category that is known as cost burden by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so what you see happening is these people are paying more for rent, and by paying more for rent, that basically causes them to have to make choices about other things. And this is a huge problem. And then you have the concept of inflation. A lot of people don't understand about inflation and things of that. But the reality is that prices are 20% higher today than they were 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that is President Biden's fault. And I'm not saying it's a Democrat fault or a Republican fault. What I'm saying is goes along with what you're saying. The reality is that the people in power, who happen to be the Democrats now, we have seen that there have been prices going up. And so a lot of times it's the economy stupid. It means that those who are watching this and experiencing this are going to say, I can't do that for another 4 years. No matter how much I like that candidate, no matter how much I appreciate that candidate's social views or their personality or whatever, I can't go in my own pocket like I have been for the next 4 years. Therefore, I'm going to have to choose the lesser of two evils in their mind, and I'm going to go with one who, I have to admit, they'll say, before the last 4 years, things were good. I was a little bit better. I had more money, and so I'm going to have to go with that person. And I honestly think what took people by surprise with this election is that, once again, the American society of all people recognized it's about the money in my pocket, the food on my table, and no matter how much I like someone, got to take care of myself and my family first. And therefore, that's why they voted the way that they voted.
Yeah, those kitchen table issues make all the difference in the world because Trump won a pretty good victory in the Electoral College and in the popular vote. Of course, like he does, he claims everything's a historic election and a landslide and all that. It certainly wasn't that, but it was a very good, very good victory. But you look at
It's a
that.
very good, Kent, and this, I can't remember. It's a very good victory because in 2016, he won the Electoral College, but he lost the popular vote.
Mm-hmm.
In 2020, he lost the popular vote and lost the Electoral College.
Mm-hmm.
So his third time, he has done better than he's done in any other election. Yep. By winning the popular vote and the Electoral College, all while being in the news about all of this other garbage and all this stuff that's going on. He still wins a popular vote, which to me is just fascinating.
It's fascinating. And I think, and this is just my personal opinion, looking at the polls and everything, I think it's going back to the economy. I think that was the big issue. I think people were very unhappy with the way the Biden administration appeared to have handled the economy, and they were ready to do something different, and Trump benefited from that. One of the things, if you study presidential history, is presidents benefit from the economy, presidents are hurt from the economy, whether they had anything to do with it, positive or negative. That's the reality. And Trump, I think, definitely benefited because if you look at favorability ratings, that is how people feel about Trump personally. They don't like him. He's unpopular at that level. So is Joe Biden. But yet you look, he got 312 electoral votes, only 270s needed. So again, he didn't, no landslide here, but he did definitely do better than he did in 2016, 2020. And it was a solid victory. If I go back to 2020, Joe Biden won 306 electoral votes. If I go back to 2008, Obama won 365 electoral votes. So Trump is sort of here in 2024. He's between Joe Biden in 2020 and Barack Obama in 2008. So it's a good victory. Again, it's not a landslide, but it is a good victory.
And I go back to this other point that you made earlier about the situation that Harris found herself in by being his vice president. Mm-hmm. He started off in 2021 with an approval rating of 53%. That was in 2021. He, welcome. We're glad you're here. We didn't like the whatever happened in the previous administration. You're here now, 53%. He ends, well, at this election in November of 2024, his disapproval rating is 56%.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she and I think the Democrats will say she made a blunder when she was asked something about what would you do different
Yep.
than President Biden. She said nothing. I can't think of anything. Well, she says that in the midst of knowing that you have a president that has a disapproval rate of 56.3% and only an approval rate of 38.7.
Right.
You've got to separate yourself from the trouble, and I don't think she did a good job in separating herself from the trouble. And so once again, you've got 56% of the people who really want to talk about the current president, and they said 56%, we don't like what he's doing. That just, I don't like this other candidate, but you know what,
He's
maybe
not,
he's going to put more
he's,
money.
I don't like the current the other candidate, but he's not the guy in there now or the lady with the guy that's in there now. And I think you're exactly right. Kamala Harris did not do enough to separate herself out from the Biden administration. And I cannot imagine Joe Biden, and I don't know the man personally, obviously, but I cannot imagine he would have gotten angry at her for separating herself. He would have had to have understood the need to do that, having been in politics as long as he has been. But she just didn't separate herself out. And I think another thing she didn't do, and is she just didn't land the airplane. It kept circling the airport, but she didn't really connect with voters. She had some very exciting rallies and that kind of thing, but she didn't really make the connection. And I think that's, the economy, that's all what was going on there. And I think it doomed her candidacy.
And the one question that I'll ask now that we can ask it is, as the Democrats will kind of go back and revisit where they went wrong, do you think there was a mistake made in the switching of the candidates?
That's gonna be the $50,000 question. Would Biden have done better? Personally, I don't think so. He may have done worse, but I could be wrong. But I'm sure there'll be a lot of second guessing on that. And should Biden have just never run for a second term to begin with?
But
I know Biden didn't say something in 2020 or 2021 about only serving one term. Should he have stuck with that instead of, doing the understandable thing? Well, I want a second term. Should he have stuck with that instead of, getting to the summer and then having to drop out because of that disastrous debate performance?
you know what? I'll go back to everybody has a bad day.
Yep.
And when you start looking back at this, he won, I don't know how many million votes through the Democratic primary and through the Democratic nomination. I mean, everybody talked about we're with them, we're with them, we're with them. So, I think that this election has shown us that it's not about the media. It's not about the big wigs in these political parties, but it comes down to, as you said, the kitchen table issues all over the place. I kind of want to, there was a lot of talk the weekend before the election. I want to get your thoughts on it. That they shared this new poll that came out in Iowa, that this one pollster came out and breaking news that Harris has a 4% lead over Trump in Iowa, which is pretty much traditionally Republican,
Yep.
Republican, Republican, not even a close race. And so people started a lot of chattering about that. And so I'm curious, do you think that all of these polls and all of this talk about Harris, 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 and the constant trying to, I guess, beat down with the words and the phrases that was used, to describe the Republican candidate. Do you think that there were some Democrat voters who just said she's got it in the bag? Number one, no need for me to go vote. She's going to win. I don't need to. I really don't need. You don't need my vote. Or number two, do you think that it ticked them off because it was just constant negativity and nothing about them as far as the kitchen table issues? What was it that just really, do you think, caused what happened to happen?
Well, that's a very interesting question because I remember seeing that poll. What was it? Last weekend, you said?
Yeah, I
Uh,
think Saturday,
I
something like
will.
that.
I think, I think what you said is very possible that people could have, thought, well, Harris is safe. We don't have to worry about it. And it caused some people to stay home. It may have, because they heard that poll and thought, well, things are going better than we expected, and may have let their guard down a little bit, so to speak. Um, I also think one of the things, and I think this question leads to another question, is why did that poll? Because the lady who did that poll in Iowa is, a very well respected pollster. She does a lot of good polling. You look at Alan Lichtman from American University, the historian there, who came up with the 13 keys to the presidency. And since I think it's 1984, he only got two wrong, and that was 2000, where he predicted Gore would win. And Gore did win the popular vote. So you could really argue he was right there, lost on Gore lost the Electoral College by what, two votes, three votes after Florida, and now 2024. And Alan Lichtman would argue his 13 keys aren't a poll, but the polls seem to have definitely in this race underestimated Donald Trump. I'm looking at a graph here, this from the BBC. The source was 538 ABC News, November 7, 2024. And what it does is it shows where Trump was in the polls and where he ended up: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and it appears Arizona as well. Trump overperformed in the election and underperformed in the polls. Harris was overperforming in the polls, or as they put it here, Harris was, I think the way they put it is, Harris was hot in the polls, but she underperformed on election day.
And I think it goes back to polls are done by a select group of individuals. It's a sampling.
Yeah.
It's not a large representation of individuals, and it has a plus or minus usually of 3% margin of error is what they talk about. And if you look at those battleground states, a lot of them were in the plus or minus 3%.
Yep.
And one of the things that everybody was talking about leading up to the election. And I mean, I can tell you, I was on the 270 to win and the Real Clear Politics and all of these different sites. And the one thing you kept seeing is, you know, the um, the battleground states of, as you mentioned, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. That the viable path for the Democrats to be president had to run through that area. And
Mhm.
as everybody was talking about, they felt they had Michigan in the bag. They felt they had Wisconsin in the bag. I think they had given up on Georgia. I think North Carolina was going to be tough. Kind of Nevada, Utah, yeah, but they really thought if we can just get Pennsylvania, we've got it. And they poured a lot of celebrities. They poured a lot of former presidents and people of power that people relate to, and they hit Pennsylvania. And that's the area that I mean, I think it is surprising about Wisconsin to a point, Michigan a little bit more so, but really Pennsylvania, it just goes to show you that you can put the multi-million-dollar people places, you can let them see and all of that. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to what have you done for me lately?
Mhm.
What am I going to get out of this? There's always, if for my vote, what am I going to get for it? And I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for these people. I can just see the polls versus the reality is people did not feel that I got what exactly I asked for. You know what I mean? See, I think that's
Yeah.
what they were saying. I didn't feel comfortable about that.
Yeah, and it was clear going, you mentioned Pennsylvania, it was clear going in if Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, either one of them, didn't win Pennsylvania, they were going to have a very hard time getting to 270. So it was almost like Pennsylvania became the key to the White House. If you won Pennsylvania, you were going to be comfortable. But When she lost Pennsylvania, that's when it was like, okay, this is over. I
And
never,
that got lost early on too, though. I
yeah,
mean, it
yeah,
wasn't like a midnight, 3 a.m.,
no,
5 a.m. I mean,
mm-mm,
they lost Pennsylvania early on, and
mhm,
then they were, saying, okay, well, let's see about Michigan. Let's see if there's
yeah,
another way. But I remember, I mean, once again, we're the election nerds, and I remember that I stayed up late, and I remember that I don't know who it was, but somebody stood up at the Democratic rally,
mhm,
and it was just like a funeral. The guy said, the vice president's not going to be here tonight. You
mhm.
guys just go into the house, and the balloons were deflated, and
You know what? You know what that reminded me of? In 2004, John Kerry and John Edwards were running, and on election night, they had the big victory party ready to go, and John Edwards, the vice presidential candidate, came out and basically that was what he was saying. It's like, we sorry. Um, and that's what happened with Kamala Harris's campaign there is like you said, it's like everything was just deflated. I think they went in that night really thinking I'm talking about the people. I'm not necessarily talking about the candidates and all that, really thinking that they had won it. And, like I said, Trump was underperforming in the polls. Harris seemed to be overperforming in some of the polls to a little bit, not a lot. The polls were like you said within the margin of error, but um, I was surprised. I'm going to tell you that I was very much surprised. I thought Pennsylvania was going to be key. I thought it was going to be very, very close. And I thought we were going to be, back in 2000 with Florida. I thought we were going to be in the same place in Pennsylvania, but I was wrong.
do you think that the election integrity, the election process, do you think it worked this year better than, and I'm not talking about because a candidate won or a candidate lost, but do you think that the system worked better this year than it did in 2020?
I think there were people who were more aware of any, you know, misbehavior, so to speak. I think, I remember was it somebody in Pennsylvania, the governor, attorney general, or somebody in Pennsylvania basically came out and said, don't try it. So I think people were looking for problems, maybe more aware of any problem that might happen. So yeah, I think probably so. But I'm going to say something here, Chris, controversial. I think if the results had been flipped, in other words, I think if Harris had gotten 312 and Trump got 227 or 226, I'm not sure that we wouldn't be right back in 2020 mode, if you know what I mean.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I was going to ask, but I do find it interesting that I saw some news article or something. I don't know what it was. And, I try to look at so many different sources, different opinions, different views, I mean, get the lay of the land. And I remember somebody saying, now let's go back and look at 2024 versus 2020. The soon to be new president received what, 60 million votes, and the vice president received what, how many votes did vice
In
president get?
2020, Joe Biden got 306 electoral votes, over 81 million, basically 81 million 200, close to 270,000 votes. Donald Trump got 232 electoral votes and about 74 million.
All
Uh,
right, so 80 and 74. And what was it this year? You had 80 million for Biden, you had 74 million for Trump. And so this year you have how many?
I'm nuts. Let me see. I don't have that. I don't see. I'm looking at 270 to win. Let me see. Hang on. 2024. It was higher. Let's see. Here it is. Donald Trump got 73,597,000 plus votes. Kamala Harris got 69 million, basically 69 million votes. So there were fewer people voting this year than voted in 2020. That's for sure.
So fewer people voting.
And Joe,
And
and really just quick, just what something just popped out at me, literally just popped out at me. If we look at 2020, Donald Trump got about 74 million votes. 2024, he got about 74 million votes. So Trump got about the same number of votes. The problem was the Democrats saw a collapse.
of like 11 million,
Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
which, you know, and my whole point with that was that somebody cannot let 2020 go, because I saw some news article that said, isn't it interesting that Biden was able to get 80 million votes and Vice President only got 69 million votes? See, 2020 was stolen. We should have had president. People cannot let things go.
And somebody at work at the college the other day told me that, the switch in the numbers this year shows that 2020 was fraudulent. And I'm like, so you're going to tell me there were what, 10 million fraudulent votes nationwide? That it was that. I mean, that to me is hard to goes back for me, Chris, it goes back to Occam's razor. The simplest and easy explanation is probably the most accurate, and that was people, at least on the Democrat side, were not as geared up about this election as they were in 2020. You got to remember in 2020, you're in the middle of a pandemic, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, all of that going on. The Democrat base was fired up. In 2024, that was just simply not the case. The
Well,
Republicans
or
were
simply
fired
not
up
the
the Democrats.
case. Yeah, and also simply not the case. They thought, oh, we got this in the bag.
Yeah.
Who's gonna reelect this guy who all these names that were thrown out at him, all these criminal charges, all these things. And so I'm sure that there were probably not 11 million, but probably 8 million Democrats who probably said, I ain't got to waste my time sitting in a
Yeah.
line for 3 hours. There's no way this Joker's going to get into the
Yep.
presidency.
Yep.
Just goes to show you your vote matters, no matter
Yep.
how close you might think it is or how far apart it might be. You always need to go out and vote.
And didn't in 2000, if memory serves me correct, I don't have it pulled up, but didn't George W. Bush win Florida by about 500 votes?
Very close,
Yeah,
to
very
the point
close.
where, it just goes to show you. We could go back to early history, go back to Andrew Johnson and the impeachment, and just one vote
Yep.
makes a difference.
Yep. Well, I hope our listeners have enjoyed this sort of review of the 2024 presidential election results. I certainly enjoyed sort of looking through some of this material. Just learned something myself. Chris and listeners, when I was pulling up the popular vote results from 2020 and 2024, I hadn't done that yet. So seeing that Trump's numbers actually held the same as I hadn't seen that yet. So I was learned something here. So Chris, thanks for another great episode. Great topic, by the way. We hope our listeners will share this episode, share the podcast with family and friends. Give us a like on Spotify. Until next time, I'm Ray,
And I'm Chris.
and talk to you later.